This is a how-to on making craft coffee at home. So we're going to go over the basic building blocks of good coffee and then quickly go over 3 different brewing methods that you can do at home. So starting out with the basic building blocks of coffee, everybody knows you have the bean, you have water, and then you have your filter method. If you can change one thing to improve the quality of your coffee, change your coffee beans. A coffee bean is an actual live bean when they roast it. So if you think about it practically, if you buy a bag of coffee that has been sitting on the shelf for 2 months, it's not going to be as fresh and as rich of flavor. And finding good quality beans is not that hard. When you're shopping, look for a roast date. If you can't find a roast date, it's probably been roasted months ago and it's pretty stale. Also, I would not suggest you ever buy ground coffee. You don't know when it was roasted, and ground coffee, usually within 24 hours, gets pretty stale. I have found some fresh roasted coffee at Walmart, but you're probably more likely to find it at like a Whole Foods, a Trader Joe's. What I would suggest is to find a local coffee shop that makes gourmet coffee. A lot of local small town coffee shops will either roast in-house or partner with a roaster. Shout out to this little bean of mine. Shout out to Rosalind Coffee. That's our favorite coffee shop. One last thing about the coffee bean is the grind of the coffee bean. We can get into grind size and then how much, but that might be a later video. One thing I do want to stress is an even grind. If you have something like a bullet grinder and that's the only thing you have, go with it. It's better fresh ground than pre-ground. However, the negative is that it won't grind your coffee evenly. You'll have big chunks, you'll have tiny pieces, and it won't get an even pour. What I would suggest, if you can, get a burr grinder. It'll grind your coffee evenly, and then you're able to control the size of your coffee grind. Last things about the building blocks of coffee. Water, the one thing I would suggest if you want to step up your game a little bit is to maybe use filtered water. We have a filter in our fridge that'll help your taste. And then we get into the brewing methods. So method number 1 is the drip coffee. Positives of this is that it's totally automated. You can put your coffee in, start it, and go. The downside is that you can't really control much of anything. And the more that you can control, the better tasting coffee that you're gonna get. What you can control with the drip method, and I'm gonna stress this again, is the quality of your coffee bean. Fresh roasted, if you can locally roasted, that's gonna really boost your coffee taste. One other thing that you can control with the drip method is keeping it cleaned somewhat regularly. This will prevent bacteria from growing within the machine and will improve your coffee quality. So the first thing that you do when making your drip coffee that I suggest is wet your filter. This is rinsing it with hot water. This will do a couple things. It'll, number 1, take a slight paper taste out of the coffee, and then secondly, it will help prep the filter for the coffee and an even water distribution. Next, put in the amount of coffee that your coffee bag suggests. I will say it's probably more than you might think. Don't skip out on the coffee beans. Start it like you normally do and let it finish. There's not much that you can control there. That's pretty basically a drip coffee method. The next method that we're going to talk about is the pour over method. Now this includes everything from Chemex to anything that's this shape of a pour over. The pour over method usually yields a smoother, less of an acidic taste to your coffee. The Chemex is probably my favorite method of making coffee. Now, getting into actually doing the pour over method. First thing you want to do, obviously, is grind your coffee and boil your water. Again, follow the bag's directions for proportion of coffee, but a pretty common proportion, they say, is about 2 tablespoons of ground coffee for every 6 ounces of water that you use. That is pretty strong. I don't even make it that strong, so adjust to what you like. So after you've ground your beans and after you've boiled your water, the first thing you want to do, just like I said with the drip coffee, is rinse out that filter. And it's also going to be warming up your pitcher or your mug if you're using a regular pour over. After you've added your coffee beans, The first thing you want to do, especially if it's a fresh roast, is pour just enough to wet all the grounds of the coffee and let it what's called bloom. This is essentially all of this fresh coffee releasing carbon dioxide. So after it's bloomed, it should look like it's almost bubbling and expanding somewhat. It takes about 30 seconds or so. Then go ahead and pour in even circles a good full pour over and let it filter through. And as I'm doing this, I want to mention this is a gooseneck kettle. You don't absolutely need this. It's very helpful because it gives a pretty precise and even pour through the coffee beans. If all you have is a pitcher or something, that's fine. You just want to make sure you have a slow, even pour, not just dumping a bunch of water in there. It should take a few pours to get your full pitcher or your cup of coffee, but as you're doing it, remember to keep that slow, even circling motion as you're filling up the pour over. Then, once your pitcher or your mug is filled, you're done, and enjoy an amazing cup of coffee. So the final method for today is the French press. So a lot of people like the French press because it tends to bring out a bolder and a richer cup of coffee. And one of the reasons that is the case is because it has a metal mesh which allows some of the oils from the coffee bean into the coffee that the other paper methods will filter out. It's also a relatively easy way to make a cup of coffee if you want a more handcrafted method that's not a drip method. One other positive is that there's no paper waste in this. Everything's right here. You have everything you need. Let's get into actually the method. After you've ground your coffee proportionally as you like it, and then you've boiled your water, there's no filter to wet here, it's metal, so it's fine. So you just dump your coffee in the French press, wet the grounds just enough to get all the grounds wet, and let it bloom. Just like the pour over method we talked about before. After that's finished, pour in about half the amount of water that you're gonna use, and let the coffee sit for 1 minute. This is going to form kind of a coffee crust at the top of the water. After a minute, you take a spoon and you break that crust, stir in the coffee, and pour in the remaining amount of water that you have for the French press. And then you let that sit for 4 minutes. After the 4 minutes are up, go ahead and put the lid back on and slowly plunge the filter through the coffee. And there you have it. You have a pretty fresh cup of French press coffee. So that's it, 3 different ways of making craft coffee at home. While there is technically the perfect cup of coffee that you can make between grind size and coffee bean and water, I do want to mention that your palate is the ultimate standard, and I want to stress that. So if you are a big fan of that pre-ground tub of coffee that you got from your great-great-grandmother on your wedding day, go for it. But I will suggest that if you compared that to a freshly ground cup of coffee that's made with a Chemex, you might see a difference. That's it. I hope you're well, and go and enjoy a good cup of coffee.